Take it away.
All right, great. So, again, thanks for having me. I'm Adam Taliaferro, so I'm in front of the U.S. Army. And so I am a strategist by trade, so not a historian, but I lead the analyst branch in the Future and Concept Center, the part of our future study program. So, told about this through Nathan, who works at Command General Staff College, about, hey, you guys are thinking about the future. You need to link in with this group to truly think about some of the ways they're assessing history and see if you can apply some of those lenses. And then, and Chris made the comment. I told him, like, hey, I can talk about our program. He's like, yeah, we know the Army's doing wargaming. We're not sure if they're doing anything worthwhile or any good. So we wanted to kind of so this is more for information about like what our program is. And I'm hopeful if this is worthwhile, one, to have a connection, get some ideas where we'd like you potentially to look at, and then come back and kind of talk about our results. Because if you hear with the Army, they're very much right now 2030. Like that is what really the entire joint forces, to be truthful, like looking at what that means for today. And that's really because of the budgeting process of how you plan. We're the only element that's really looking at 2040. And because we think there's some differences in the future operational environment. So, and eventually that 2030 will become 2040 and the entire enterprise will move along. But so I work at Army Futures Command, which been around 4 years now, which sounds kind of weird, but kind of the most transformational shift in the Army in a long time, where they actually created a new 4-star command to look specifically at modernizing the Army for a number of reasons. And as a part of that, my organization, the Futures and Concept Center, writes the concepts and helps develop like those future capabilities. So, and that's really what I'll talk about. So next slide, please. Great. So I think, there's a lot of different agencies that do wargaming or experimentation across the Army. I think you talked about the Center for Army Analysis, which really lives in like that 2030 present. They are actually doing wargaming to determine about funding and designing current force structure. So that's really where they live, hence why they're at Fort Belvoir. If you're familiar with TRAC or the Research Analysis Center, they do more entity level analysis, where you're looking at analysis of alternatives to what does that next tank look like? And if you're doing multiple simulations, determine, is this the right system that you should purchase or design? We live in a different space where we do system exploration. So really, we're not looking at achieving specific outcomes. A lot of times, we're just trying to develop better questions because, we look at concepts. A lot of times, people forget that they're aspirational by nature. And like Don Starry, look at air-land battle. The whole idea is that you're trying to transform a service to achieve that. Thus it would be doctrine. And a lot of times with our concepts in the Army, I would argue that many times they're called concepts, but really they're just deviations on doctrine. And one of the ways I ended up in this organization, me and Nathan and our buddy Amos Fox wrote an article about the Army's wrong about future warfare. And it was talking about, and a lot of times articles go nowhere, but this one time it got like a lot of traction in general. So I ended up going to that organization. But it was the idea that with new doctrine and these new ideas, are you really thinking about the environment right? So in this, where I live now, we get to do these war games where we're really trying to explore that space to figure out what does it look like given the new changes, whether it's a threat. We look specifically at peer adversaries, and that's off the national defense strategy. So whether it's Russia or China, we're looking at what that would look like. Hopefully it never happens, but that's what we're doing. And at that operational level. So specifically at the joint campaigning, achieving some type of broad objective, and how would the Army support that, whether as a supportive or the supporting force, which is really new for us, to be truthful, because for the past 20 years, you can even before that, the Army has generally been the supportive force. And depending on what environment you're looking at, that may not be true. So this is kind of what we talk about by the books. And I think most of you guys living in this space are pretty familiar, but we try to live right there where that Venn diagram is over experiments. So we have what we believe are hypotheses, and I'll talk about that. And then doing some research, and maybe just a little bit of training, but not really. A lot of times when people talk about when they're doing experiments or exercises, they're not doing systems exploration. They're actually looking at known points and trying to figure out what that means. And we're completely different than that. And when I talk about the concept, that's what we're saying. Is there a central idea? Is it valid? Does it hold weight? And how does it align? And if I look at concepts of the past, I think a lot of times we're still trying to chase the ghost of air-land battle. And people talk about the Big Five and how great, the M1, the Bradley fighting vehicle, the Apache, Black Hawk, those are actually already in development. Most people don't know. You can make an argument that the MLRS was probably the most revolutionary thing, but no one ever talks about that. But it was those other things that, and arguably weren't really a transformational shift. The Black Hawk is just the evolution of the Huey in many cases, or the Cobra and the Apache and the M1. So what are there new transformational things that would enable us to think about how we would fight differently? And then going to our taxonomy. So Jeff Applegate, we've read his book, The Craft of Wargaming, which is kind of shocking. There's not a lot of doctrine when you think about wargaming, but his book really gets at the heart of how you do it. And then like Peter Perla, who The Art of Wargaming talks about, the future study program, believe it or not, used to be called Unified Quest. And that was like the Army's Title 10 war game. Every service has like a big capstone war game. Air Force has Plan Blue. Space Force now has Schriever war game. But a lot of them, quite frankly, are very nebulous in their approach and what they're getting after. So we used Ellie Bartle's taxonomy to start figuring out where do we actually live. And we're somewhere right there in that middle. So if you look at the top, a lot of war games, I would argue, are really workshops where, are the non-polite ways of box at, which are helpful, but really in some cases, are you really getting after something? Or you have a seminar war game where you're looking at some type of scenario and you kind of do action reaction. Obviously, simulations that we don't do, just because many times if you're looking at humans out the loop or little in the loop, we're not getting after the fundamental human decision making that you need to understand with concepts. And then we are not, LtC. We are not a rotation that's actually looking at fighting today's threats. So we live on that right side, somewhere between system exploration and innovation, because we're looking to understand that problem and develop those strategies to solve those. So kind of our case study that we looked at, and this was, Nathan kind of talked about it in detail, was that we needed something to explain from a historical standpoint what we were trying to do. And it was like, we talk a lot about modernization, but was that the right lens? And so we talk about, the rise of modern mechanized warfare in that interwar period. And he talked about it. I mean, in a lot of cases, a lot of the forces were doing new things. And then depending on what you read, the French probably had some of the best tanks out there. The Italians and the Brits had great radios. Duhay was talking about how you could use airplanes and novel solutions. But it was like, how do you actually tie all this together? And what's the problem you're actually trying to solve? And for us, that was the thing that we're always trying to figure out. Because we'll talk about new things like hypersonic weapons. We're talking about extended range cannons. You're looking at AI autonomy. But what problems are you actually trying to do? And when we looked about through World War II, as Nate talked about, how do you actually develop a concept that solves that and then that matches your warfighting culture? And this is something that we think about, but if you've seen what the Marines are doing, and I think we talked about this during the break, you would not believe how much pushback they've gotten from their retired 3- and 4-star generals when you think about like getting rid of tanks. And logically to us, it makes all the sense in the world, but does that match the essence of what this institution thinks it's going to be? I was last week we were talking about this with N72 up at the Pentagon, because unlike us, the Navy, a lot of your concept development is up at the Department of the Navy. And he was telling me, because the Naval War College runs a lot of their war games, and just the idea of like, let's take 10% of our fleet and make it unmanned. He told me, and I may get it wrong, the Black Shoe Force, I think was his, couldn't even discuss this idea of not having a manned, 300, 400, 500 man fleet. And the same with us. And we talked about like this idea of kind of a Frederikian approach of more concentric fires commands that create standoff does not really fit in the essence of an army that wants to do combined arms maneuver, regardless of the terrain. So how do you think about this? And it almost constrains your approaches, but it can be done. And I think we use Germany as well, at least in the early stages of the conceptual approaches that they were trying to do, for better or for worse. And that idea of, the Kesselkron, I'll bastardize the name, but this idea of the cauldron approach of the frontal and then the envelopments, the idea of what becomes your unit of action. When we talk about the backbone, that's a lot of things that, what is really where you're orienting your forces, and then how would you actually do it? And so basically we say the French modernized, but it was the Germans at 1940 that transformed. And how do we create that for the US Army? And then we looked at past concepts to figure this out. Air-land battle was a modernization, but it worked, and it worked. And the fact that the Air Force and the Army were tied in, that's what you needed. And you had new capabilities that enabled you to fight it, or at least in Iraq. We'll never know if it would have worked Germany to isolate the first and second echelons, but, we generally believe. But for those familiar, Force 21, if anybody's familiar with that concept, like the Army's going to be, we will all-knowing, all-seeing, but really did not have a warfighting concept. And guys did not want to think about this idea of just having computers. And then coming out of the coin era, we had Win in a Complex World, which just said the whole world's complex, just figure it out, which isn't really inspiring to a course, this idea that everything's just kind of jacked up. And then our last one prior was full spectrum operations. Okay, you didn't like that? Just do everything. Offense, defense, stability, ops, and support civil authorities, which again, doesn't speak to the essence and where do you weight your efforts. So that was all in our background of what we're trying to do. So for us, we have our hypothesis is our concept. And then again, if we come back, I'd love to talk about kind of what we're doing with this concept. But we have a central idea that we think we want to fight. And I won't necessarily talk about that, but at the end, I'll talk about some of the emerging things. And I welcome your feedback on some of the ideas we think are going to drive the future. But our hypothesis will drive the questions we want to ask. And that will bound kind of our war games, which is very different than what we used to do, to be fair. In a lot of cases, it's like all learning was good learning, and let's just put people together and see what emerges. But we design our war games, again, this refines and forms. And and I look to the bottom there in that red triangle, Caffrey from the Air Force Research Lab kind of has this triad of what you want to get after. And we're the Title 10 war games, whether it's Air Force, Navy, and Marines, you're trying to kind of fit in the middle. We actually don't want to win. Winning actually doesn't really matter in these games because, again, you know, it's an experiment, you never know. And we're not trying to follow doctrine. So you think about combat command exercises. That's what they're trying to do with a fight and no plan. And then we're not necessarily trying to stimulate the game to see if your command post can actually work. We're somewhere in that middle. And this is what we're trying to do.
The Title 10 games, I've seen them closer to that right bottom.
That's right. And some of that's tied to, I think, you want your senior leader involvement, like whether it's the chief of staff or the Army, but what it comes to sometimes is you just ends up fighting current day force, which is helpful, but you have many tools. You have CAA and SHRAC that can do that for you. Because they live in that current budgetary knife fight, they don't necessarily have the ability to think deeper. And we're trying to get after what we talked about with this idea of how do you develop a concept that takes into account all the things that we think are going to happen in the future. So this is kind of what we've done in terms of our approach. And the unique thing about this with Army Futures Command, which has been pretty different, at least from the Army standpoint of how we war games, is that if you look at that bottom banner, we've actually built everybody in together. So we use the threat community, so that's actually a part of it. So we have a 2039 Intel validated threat now. So we say 2039 because that literally is the farthest that the Intel community will go out and basically put something in writing that says that what the future threat will look like. But it gives us credibility to think about how we'll fight this. We have the S&T community. So Dr. Cott, who I know from previous war games, Chief Scientist ARL, who was up here earlier, we've actually got them now in the room to understand exactly, what's in the realm of the possible emerging technology. So we just don't continually sprinkle AI dust. And then I'll skip conceptors that are me within the operational community who gives us that sanity check. So a lot of times 3 Corps out of Fort Hood, so we get the Army community, we've got 18th Airborne, light fighters, and then some of the guys from U.S. Army Pacific and 1st Corps to give us that flavor of what they're thinking about. And that's how we're trying to build these concepts to have better buy-in. For those that are familiar with multi-domain operations, which is the current concept in these streets right now, a lot of tension in terms of, when that hit the ground, just because a lot of guys thought it was old wine in a new bottle. And because really we waited to the last minute to tell them, here's the new concept. This is what we think the Russian threat will look like. This is how we think we should prosecute it. And it's like, as he's, oh, this is just airland battle with some cyber thrown in. I could do this every day, which again, doesn't really help you. So at the top there, what we did to start this, we did like a seminar where we brought in 400 different people from across the country, completely unclassed. We had, like I said, S&T, environmental scientists. We even had a lot of think tanks, so Michael Hanlon, we had AEI, Rand, Brookings, and then we had some Peter Singer from like Ghost Week fame, some science fiction writers to tell us, what do you think this future looks like? Unbound us, because if we tell you, we'll say the future looks a lot like today. So tell us where we're wrong. And they started to identify some of the ideas that by 2040, we do think there would be a proliferation of some things, some ideas in terms of mesh networks, being able to do edge computing at scale, the idea of having some type of smart systems, and the proliferation of drones are probably be in the realm of the possible. So we took that and then went to our next game where we did a solarium where we gave 4 different groups kind of all the same tools and scenarios and said, okay, given this, how would you fight this? And they couldn't do it, quite frankly, like it was just too much. But what we found was a lot of the problems that we think are going to happen in the future are all cross-cutting. So like the deception piece, we're willing to stand on the ground right now that we think deception will be, the scale will probably be at the scale of 1940. That because you can see so much right now, you will not be able to hide forces, you will have to hide intent. So what does deception look like? We don't know yet, but if you're not considering it, how you think about the future, you're probably fooling yourself. And I would say with Ukraine, I mean, if you've seen the pictures of those wooden HIMARS systems that they're building everywhere, that you would think, yes, shocking, yes, right, everywhere, and this, and it's working to create some type of operational tactical effect. So then we went to our third word game and we put all our S&T guys in the front. And we're like, okay, here's these problems. We don't know how to fix, we don't know what we're doing yet, but we know we have these problems. Are there potential technologies that would be technology ready level 6, which is within the government system, means you can be able to prototype it by 2035. So we can assume in that 4-year process, we could have it. And they started to line out stuff across terms of networking, how you could actually operate in a denied or degraded network environment. In terms of deception, what tools you could actually do to create these problems. And then most importantly, how could you sustain a future force? Because in all of our war games, we have tried the Iron Mountain and it just fails. And I think even most joint war games would say the same thing, is that it's just not sufficient against a peer adversary. So then we had to figure out how could we put all this together, and we needed a war game that actually allows us to do it. The challenge with a lot of war games, you either kind of get very hard simulations, which doesn't have the humans, or you kind of deviate to kind of a seminar war game where pinning the loudest person in the room can completely skew the entire result. And I would argue the most worst thing is that your enemy ends up being 10 feet tall. And I think with multi-domain operations, and again, time will tell, but it was driven by the Russian New Generation Warfare Study, which was following Crimea and Georgia, how Russia was going to fight. And I think we got almost every assumption wrong. and it's shocking just because we thought they were in it. We didn't realize the level and state of their sustainment. We didn't know the deficiencies, the equipment, quite frankly, some of the reports in terms of like truck half shafts breaking. I mean, you're talking like basic 10 level stuff that we were shocked to see. And then kind of the operational approach, in terms of what you talked about, in terms of how, the IPV of using traditional kind of high-speed avenues of approach and not being able to kind of create any type of disruption effect to penetrate. And then lastly, like the air superiority, like, we thought air S-400s were the pinnacle of kind of air defense capability, and Ukraine's ability to even use small drones or even fire Russia's inability. So it's like, we need a tool that allows us to get at this interaction, because we know the enemy's not 10 feet tall, but we also don't want them to be like it doesn't matter. So thanks to the Marines, we actually are using the Operational War Game System, commonly known as OWS. And if not sure if you're familiar, I'd welcome to come down and use this or try it out. What's interesting, Marine War College developed this for PME as a tool just to kind of teach some learning objectives. But what came out of it, it actually creates a way to actually get dynamic force-on-force fighting at the war game level. And like it says, it's got rigor because it's semi-adjudicated, so you can actually kind of control the environment, but it's inherently joint. And for whatever reason, when whoever designed this game, if you fight as a single service, you will lose, just because of the nature of your fighting all capabilities. And so it actually forces you to think about how you would fight. And then what we found was Vassal, that pitch on the bottom right, gamers across the country, well, really the world, use Vassal, which is a freeware gaming network. And you can build your own games. And we were able to build OWS in it. And most importantly, it was free. And then we own the proprietary information. So we were able to do a tabletop with a virtual system at the same time. And then we created what's called a double blind, which I think you guys are familiar. So you think about wargaming, I think William talked about it, like wargaming for planning generally sucks because you're red and blue, you see everything. It's action, reaction, counteraction. So red, and it's the threat community, we put them in their own room, blue goes in their other room, and then you're fighting dynamically. And there's step processes, but so the air campaign perhaps, both forces are fighting at the same time. So you're trying to figure out how to prosecute an air campaign while you're trying to defend your critical assets. So it gets to this human dynamics of fighting. And we've been able, I think the max we've ran is 10 days. So although it does not model the effects of like a long duration war, it is the closest of thinking about humans having to think day in and day out how you would prosecute a war and thinking over time. So it's allowed us to use the concept of like, all right, guys, here is how we think you should fight in the future. Red, we want you to fight based on red, the enemy's literature, fight their fight. Don't fight as an American, fight their fight. And it's given us a lot of test cases. We've done 5 iterations of this using this, and it's really been able us to understand how we think we would fight in the future. So again, I will tell you, like, truth in lending, like, it is classified, but now meeting all of you guys and realizing that you all are somewhat in the DoD enterprise, I would love to follow, reach back out and come back and either schedule like some type of classified form, or at least I'll work to get it FDO'd so we can come back, because I'd love to talk about some of the results and what we're seeing, because what you're doing is what we'd love to be able to get more analysis or granularity. Because our challenge is we've got some quantitative data, because there's limitations. We aggregate at the battalion level. So because we're thinking about the operations, but we're trying to figure out what are really the bigger effects. Is it the operational fires? Is it ground? What are the things that are really, turning the tide in this conflict? And it also allows us to see what people truly value. Yes.
Do you play this as an inter-service game, or does you just have somebody who's the
No.
the ground commander?
No, it's an inter-service. So it's actually joint and multinational. So the Navy plays the CIFMIC. We have, so from N72 plays them. We use the Marine Corps Warfighting Lab, who will play the Marines. Lumet Center, which is the Air Force's kind of think tank, will play the CFAC. And then right now we're at the 5I level. So we play Canada, UK, Britain, Australia, New Zealand. Hopefully we'd like to expand, but that's where the limit. And then generally the Brits will play the division team, the multinational division, and the Kiwis will generally play kind of the lead sustainment plan, depending on the scenario we play. But it's been fascinating because they bring their new technologies that they're going to fight as well. The challenge with this, though, and that's why I was so interested in William Sayers, we have a COFOM. What we're trying to figure out, though, is how can you model future technologies with enough fidelity that it's credible across a broad community? So like directed energy weapons, we think that's going to be something that's going to be very powerful, because it changes the calculus when you think about these exquisite hypersonics. Everybody's developing them, but that may be the actual game changers, because now you're just talking power sources. But how do you model that in a way that gets after that? This deception piece of spoofing, the electronic magnetic spectrum, we think has immense possibilities in a ways that we've done some games where you don't even know what's real, because you can spoof so much in this new battlefield, because with commercial sensing like Maxar, they push out, I think, every 2 days, updated Russian forward line. It's fascinating. And it's just electromagnetic. You could spoof that and really confuse, because you're just talking a little node, as long as they can have an RF frequency. But how do we model that? So we're seeing some neat things, but and I'll tell you, so this is really what I'd welcome some comments on, because I recognize it's new. But so this is the top 4 are the things that we're seeing and that we think matter to the future. So this first one, this idea of transparent battlefield, and we talked about it a little bit, and it's a weird misnomer, but we don't have a better name yet, because we know the fog of friction will still exist in the battlefield. But, we talked about like Ukraine is giving us so much right now, because whether it's NAFO, through Twitter, Maxar, it's too funny the war. There is an immense amount of information that you collect immediately.
That's to say nothing of what we're doing on the high side.
That's right. That's right.
We have a colleague who has just left the J5 in Pentagon. He's a space warfare officer. He has a great comment. He says, to try to relate this, the left hook in the Gulf War will never happen unobserved again, ever, on any battlefield. What we're doing for Ukraine, the enemy will do for anyone we fight. And so 3 Corps, 18th Corps, if you're going to do big movements, it will be seen. So as Adam said, you can only mask intent. So imagine the Germans, they're at the river at Sedan. French don't know where they're going to go. They could go to Paris, go south to flank the Maginot Line. And until they do it, that's the only thing they could really mask now, right? Because now everyone would know, oh, they're in the Ardennes. That would not be hidden right now.
And that's what we're trying to figure out. But we think this matters. And it's weird because we talked to some of our senior leaders, and they hate this phrase because they're like, even in Iraq, I never felt like I had a perfect picture. It's like, we're not saying you will have transparency, but the battlefield will be transparent, which kind of conflates terms. But we're trying to figure out how to make people understand this idea that you have to think about how do you, in time and space, because deception right now, like nobody owns that actually across the services. Like no one actually is a proponent for deception. If you look at like the joint pub on deception, it's really a lot of principles. Like the Army it's an office in Fort Leavenworth that is actually the proponent. And then within the planning, the G5 is supposed to own it. But I don't want to think about deception. I want to think about big arrows going across the place.
Not to hijack
No,
your
please,
brief.
please.
There's also an opposing thing here. So like the dialectic where you also have the noisy battlefield at the same time.
Right, yes.
Right. And so I challenge my students, if you're in MND Baghdad in the division staff headquarters, 2007, what is your SIGACT read look like? It's thousands every day. You don't know who which enemy, there's like 50 insurgencies, which allies, what battle from reports from your own units do you believe? And so you bring that, you layer that in on top of the after transparency. How do you make sense of that?
And like, right. And you look at this map, that's even just a small part, but I think that's probably an Indo-PACOM map there. But like, those are counters. That represents battalion level entities. Like I could show you the maps that when you talk about large scale, it's crazy amount of forces. And we're only talking maybe, handful of divisions, couple of numbered fleets. And then on the other side, like their forces, it's mind boggling. The next one, the AI augmented autonomous systems. I mean, I think everybody generally is talking about AI, autonomy, machine learning. We do believe at some level this will aggregate, start to proliferate. I mean, we're seeing it now. Nagorno-Karabakh, I think, although I wouldn't call those fully autonomous, but I think you did see a number of different drones that are at least being controlled. I think we're seeing, what Russia now is buying Iranian drones to start to try to counter that effect. I think this is going to proliferate at scale. And it's just a matter of how do you deal with this? And not exactly sure, please. Yeah.
As we can, I think on the Nagorno-Karabakh war, I think one major caveat is that the drones, the suicide drones, the Harov and Barak cars blew up big because if on Twitter it's very easily filmable. I do think it's worth noting, and that's what War on the Rocks, of course, had hundreds of articles on that. I do think it's worth noting that if you look at, from what we've been able to see from translated passages from Armenian and Azeri thinking post-war, it's a lot more. The Azeris got better conventionally. In terms of those Azeri mechanized battalions getting better and the Armenians stagnating. So I do think just one thing to maybe keep in mind is like, we may at times, if something being easily visible and needs to be put onto social media, may also overinflate.
Oh, no question. I think, yeah, to me, so that looks back at that transparent battlefield because that's the new way of you can actually you can affect the homeland in ways that you probably couldn't do before in real time. Because I saw, not to the level that you talked about, but the shock, I guess we called it the shock effect earlier, but seeing that in real time, like it's crazy how that can, so the drone swarms is the thing that we're really excited about and how do you deal with that? So like the aviation community is building air launched effects. So like firing drones instead of firing hellfires and this idea, how do you prosecute, this is emergence of all this capacity. So, and the fact that where do you need humans at this forward line if you could essentially create autonomous areas where that fight is very different. And I think, it may just the way fires looks today where you're firing farther than you're operating, perhaps it's machines operating. And that goes into number 3. I think we're seeing this right now, and we know everybody's developing them. It's almost kind of a race who's going to get there first. But hypersonic weapons, it's interesting that you can now you can shoot farther than you can sense versus shooting farther than you can move. And now that challenge gets back to who is the forward observer? How are you observing these things that are shooting across the areas? I mean, this is open source stuff, but there's a missile a country's developing that they're calling the Guam killer. So that's not classified, but because they believe they can range that far. It's unprecedented amounts of range that are being developed right now. And what does that mean in terms of protection and maneuver? And then the last one from sovereign borders. We do not war game policy. We do not, we don't have people represent, they'd be making stuff up at best. But we do believe in terms of how we constrain is that there may be a chance that your threat won't be able to fire from sanctuary and you can't fire back in. I think we're actually seeing that in Ukraine right now, which is really interesting about the elections, if you will, and that becomes defended territory. And this idea that, what does that mean in terms of where we'll allow Ukrainians to fire? We have to figure out what that means. There's always the idea of, nuclear war. We don't make we hope we have to deal with that. But in terms of being able to fire hypersonics from Satan, how do you fire back? And in other countries, we know they develop a fires defense system so different than us because it's developed specifically to defend their homeland and it's not made to fire forward. So again, more problems. And this is kind of our working problem. And as you can see, it's really just taking all this stuff and then how do you transform with all these modernized things that we're doing to be able to do this. And then, as I said before, we are at that bottom line, which seems pretty simple, but for an army, that's a big deal to acknowledge as a supporting force, because we recognize in many cases that it won't be us. So that's it in a nutshell. I will say, moving forward, I think our goal, we'd like to, if it's possible, to come back next year and actually talk about what we found in terms of our analysis. I'd love to talk about, some of the tools that we're using, and then for those that would like to come out to our war games, we welcome to have you. One, to work with this analysis cell with me, and just I'd love the red team, because what we're trying to do is get people to grade our work, because the more credible we can get it in the front end, we'll get more buy-in. We don't want to tell the force that we're getting rid of their tanks and never give anybody to show our work. I say that tongue in cheek, but like we have lived that fight. Through the lending, we tried to get rid of, tried to move all of our Apaches out of the National Guard, and we know what that looks like.